So King Charles has apparently told William the crown must pass now, and the whole thing was decided in a 3-minute meeting that was supposed to last 20. That's the part that keeps sticking with me. Not the announcement itself, not the palace drama, but the fact that a conversation scheduled for 20 minutes ended after barely 3, and somehow that became the exact moment the future of the monarchy changed. Like if you're going to make the biggest decision of your reign, you'd think it would take longer than a coffee break. But that's where this story gets weird, because the more you look at what was said versus what actually happened, the more the timeline stops making sense. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to Crown Watch so you don't miss any updates on this story. So let's break down what supposedly went down at Windsor. Charles gathered the family and told them he intended to step aside from active sovereign responsibility and begin transferring the central burden of the crown to William immediately. Not gradually, not symbolically, immediately. And the language he used was apparently very specific. He said the crown must pass now, not soon, not eventually. Now, and when you actually look at the words, there's a necessity hidden in there that William apparently picked up on right away, because soon suggests planning. Now suggests something forced his hand, and that's the part nobody in that room could ignore. William didn't answer at first. Camilla froze. Anne noticed something in the transition documents that suggested the timing had been moved forward abruptly. So right away, you've got multiple people in the room realizing this wasn't some long-planned retirement announcement. Something had changed 3 days earlier, and Anne was the one who finally decided William deserved to know what it was. Now, here's where the timeline gets genuinely confusing. 3 days before this family meeting, Charles and William had a private conversation at Windsor. It was scheduled for 20 minutes. It ended after barely 3. William walked away thinking his father was just exhausted. Charles stayed behind in silence, and according to the story, those 3 minutes became the point of no return. But what actually happened in those 3 minutes? From what's been described, William raised a concern about how duties were shifting without clear control. He told his father that uncertainty could become more dangerous than change. Charles listened, stopped speaking midway through, stared at an open briefing folder, and then said something that apparently hit harder than anything else. "You are already carrying what I am pretending is still mine." So if that's true, then this wasn't really a decision made in 3 minutes. It was a realization that had been building for months. The king had already been handing over responsibilities quietly. William was already handling demanding engagements and sensitive family decisions. The authority just hadn't caught up to the reality. And Charles apparently reached a breaking point where continuing to pretend otherwise felt more dangerous than just admitting what was already happening. But here's what I don't fully understand. If the transition was already underway, why did the announcement need to feel so abrupt? Why not present it as a gradual, dignified process? The story suggests Charles rejected the slower path because he believed divided authority would leave William carrying responsibility without the clarity to use it properly. That makes logical sense. But it also creates a pretty uncomfortable question for everyone around him. Because if the king had been quietly preparing for this before the family meeting, then how many people knew before Camilla did? And that's where the emotional core of this whole thing sits. Camilla apparently confronted him afterward, and her first words weren't diplomatic. She said, "You decided all of this without me." And honestly, that's the most believable part of the entire story. Because regardless of constitutional rules or succession planning, this is still a marriage. And finding out your husband made the biggest decision of his life before telling you would feel like a betrayal even if the decision itself was the right one. Charles didn't defend himself. He told her he'd delayed the conversation because he knew she would hear it as the premature ending of a chapter they believed still had time. Camilla then asked the question that cuts through everything. Had William pressured him to step aside? Charles rejected it immediately. He said William had actually urged caution and argued against any rushed decision. That detail matters because it removes the easy target. Camilla couldn't blame William. She couldn't blame advisors. The choice belonged to Charles alone, and that made it harder to fight. Now, I want to talk about what this transition actually means in practical terms, because the story gets into some detail that's worth understanding. Royal authority doesn't change through speeches. It changes when documents, people, and decisions start moving towards someone else. The red briefing folder moment is a perfect example of this. An official placed the monarch's confidential daily government material on the table and almost without thinking slid it toward William before glancing nervously at Charles. The king noticed. He paused, touched the edge of the folder, then deliberately pushed it the remaining distance toward his son. William didn't open it immediately. Charles finally broke the silence and said, "Do not make me ask twice." No anger, which somehow made it worse. That moment tells you everything about how power actually transfers. It's not about titles or ceremonies. It's about who receives the red folder, who gets the first briefing, who people instinctively turn toward when they enter a room. And once that starts shifting, it doesn't reverse. Charles had demanded exactly this, but watching it happen proved far harder than deciding it should. The story describes these small, painful changes: a briefing delivered to William first, a schedule rearranged without Charles being consulted, an aide pausing outside the wrong door before remembering where authority now rested. For decades, everyone around the king had been trained to move toward him. Suddenly, the movement changed direction, and even though Charles had instructed it, the experience of watching the world learn to live without asking him first was something else entirely. There's another layer here that doesn't get discussed enough, and it's the institutional machinery behind these changes. The palace isn't just a family home. It's an operational system with protocols, precedents, and people whose entire professional identities are built around serving the sovereign. When the direction of authority shifts, hundreds of small adjustments happen behind the scenes. Correspondence patterns change, meeting invitations get reordered, the flow of information quietly reroutes itself, and the people inside that system, the private secretaries, the press officers, the household staff, have to recalibrate their instincts almost overnight. That's not just emotionally difficult for the family, it's structurally disorienting for everyone who works there. William felt the pressure from the other side. He started receiving heavier papers, longer schedules, and questions that could no longer be returned to Charles for the final answer. Catherine began preparing for a larger role beside him, knowing that increased authority would bring increased scrutiny into their family life, and work between both sides, making sure her brother was treated with dignity while refusing to create uncertainty about where responsibility was moving. She understood that kindness without clarity could damage everyone. There's a moment in this story where Catherine challenges William privately. He had insisted that Charles attend one of his first planned meetings, not as the final decision maker, but as his father and predecessor. Catherine warned that turning every new responsibility into a tribute would eventually weaken the very transition Charles had chosen. If his father had truly passed authority forward, then honoring him meant learning when to decide differently. That's a sharp observation, because there's a real risk in transitions like this. The incoming person wants to show respect by deferring, but deference can undermine the clarity that the transition was supposed to create. Catherine's point also speaks to something broader about how institutions handle generational change. You can't truly empower a new leader while constantly asking the previous one to bless every decision. At some point, the new person has to own the role completely, including the mistakes. Otherwise, the institution ends up with two centers of gravity, and everyone inside it starts hedging their bets, wondering which one really holds the future. That kind of ambiguity is corrosive. It breeds caution, delays, and quiet power struggles that never surface openly but slow everything down. Charles understood this. Catherine understood it too. William needed a moment to accept it. William eventually accepted that warning, but before the next public step, he asked for something specific. He wanted Charles alone, no advisors, no papers, no ceremony, just father and son. And that private conversation is where the emotional weight of the story really lands. William admitted he was frightened, not by ceremonies or crowds, but by the possibility of making one decision his father would have handled better. Charles told him becoming king didn't mean becoming infallible. A sovereign could still hesitate, misjudge, and regret. The responsibility wasn't to avoid every mistake, it was to face each one without hiding behind the crown. Then William asked the question that mattered most: did Charles regret announcing that the crown must pass now? The silence before the answer apparently stretched. Charles finally said he regretted that the moment had become necessary, but he did not regret trusting his son. He explained that he had personally rejected a prolonged halfway arrangement because divided authority would force William to lead while constantly wondering whether his father might overrule him. Then he gave William the hardest lesson: never confuse protecting the institution with protecting the comfort of the people inside it. The monarchy could survive painful decisions more easily than it could survive leaders who delayed those decisions simply because they feared hurting someone close to them. That's the line that sticks with me, because it applies far beyond royal succession. It's about leadership generally. The instinct to delay hard choices because you don't want to hurt people you care about is very human, but it often creates more damage than the decision itself would have caused. Charles apparently understood that, and he was willing to absorb the personal cost of being the one who made the call. What makes this even more striking is that Charles spent most of his adult life waiting for his own mother's reign to end, waiting for his turn, waiting through decades of public skepticism and personal criticism. And when the moment finally arrived, he didn't cling to it. He didn't try to stretch it out or redefine the role to keep himself central. Instead, he recognized that the institution's needs had shifted faster than anyone expected. That's not what most people predicted from him. And whether you believe the story or not, that reversal is compelling. Now, outside the palace walls, the public reaction was its own thing. The announcement spread across broadcasts, phones, front pages, and crowded pavements. Within minutes, some people saw sacrifice. Others saw inevitable succession arriving ahead of schedule, but across every interpretation ran the same feeling. Something familiar had shifted. Charles was still present. William was still his son. Yet Britain was suddenly looking at both men differently, and neither could ever completely reverse that change. William watched the first wave of coverage, with Catherine beside him. Broadcasters described him as the new center of royal life, while palace communications stressed continuity, the deliberate effort to show that the monarchy remained stable even as authority changed hands. Catherine switched off the television and reminded him that public language would always move faster than private emotion. He could become the focus of the institution in a day, but becoming comfortable with what that meant would take far longer. Charles faced the opposite pain. He heard crowds beyond the palace gates chanting William's name, and pride arrived beside something he didn't want to call grief. Camilla stayed close enough to recognize the change in him. She reached for his hand when no one else was near and held it without speaking. He had chosen this transfer himself, yet hearing the country turn emotionally toward his son made the sacrifice real in a way documents never could. One broadcaster apparently changed the tone of the national conversation with a single description. He called the event a king choosing the moment of departure rather than allowing circumstance to choose it for him. That phrase spread quickly because it transformed the story from defeat into sacrifice. Charles was no longer being discussed only as the monarch stepping away. He was being seen as the father who had decided that protecting stability required surrender and control. And honestly, that framing makes sense, because the alternative, that Charles was forced into this by some external pressure, would have been a much messier story. The idea that he chose it deliberately and painfully gives the transition a kind of dignity that circumstance-driven change wouldn't have had. But here's what I keep coming back to. The story starts with a 3-minute meeting that was supposed to last 20, and the more you think about that detail, the more it reveals. Charles had been preparing quietly before the family ever entered that room. The transition documents were already drafted. The advisors had already been consulted. The slower path had already been rejected. So the family meeting wasn't where the decision was made, it was where the decision was revealed. And the gap between those two things, the making and the revealing, is where all the pain lived. That gap also explains why the 3-minute conversation carries so much weight. It wasn't that Charles made the entire decision in that brief window, it was that he stopped hiding from it. He allowed himself to say out loud what he had been privately arranging for weeks. The meeting was the moment the internal became external, and once that line is crossed, there is no taking it back. Words spoken in a room like that, between a king and his heir, have a permanence that no amount of careful planning can undo. Camilla felt it as exclusion. William felt it as sudden weight. Anne saw it as evidence that something specific had happened 3 days earlier. And Charles experienced it as the distance between deciding something alone and watching the people you love react to it. The story ends with William standing where his father had stood before him. But the most important image isn't a crown or a signature or a palace balcony. It's a father recognizing that duty had changed shape. Charles had spent most of his life waiting for the throne and far less time occupying it than history once seemed to promise. His final defining act in this dramatized story was not holding power. It was releasing it deliberately, painfully, and with enough certainty to tell his son, "Now it is yours." William accepted that responsibility without pretending he could become a copy of his father. He understood that continuity meant preserving the stability and duties of the monarchy while allowing leadership to change with a new sovereign. He honored Charles, but he accepted that his own judgment would now stand on its own. Loyalty couldn't become imitation, respect couldn't become hesitation. Charles moved into a quieter role with defined responsibilities, remaining part of family life without competing with William's authority. Before his son's first major appearance, he reached over and adjusted William's cuff instinctively. Neither man spoke for several seconds. In that small gesture, Monarchy became family again. Camilla felt the bitterness soften into something steadier. She had fought the timing, questioned the secrecy, and feared what the change would take from them. Now she chose loyalty over resentment. She stayed beside Charles as he entered the quieter chapter he had accepted, understanding that their years together were not erased because their public roles had changed. Anne understood her brother's decision with clarity. She saw that Charles had not stepped aside because the monarchy meant less to him. He had stepped aside because preserving it mattered more than preserving his own place at its center. That was the sacrifice beneath everything. William carried the final lesson with him. Inheriting the crown did not mean defeating the generation before him. His father's surrender of authority had become one last lesson in kingship. Power had value only when someone knew when to use it, when to share it, and when to release it. And so Charles's words became more than an announcement. They became his final statement about duty. Power was never truly his to possess forever, only his to carry until the moment came to place it willingly into William's hands. There is something quietly devastating in that image. A lifetime spent waiting for the crown, and the most memorable act of his reign was handing it over, not because he failed, but because he recognized that the institution required something he had not planned to give. That kind of self-awareness is rare in any leader. It is almost unheard of in a king, and whether you see the story as truth or speculation, the emotional logic is hard to dismiss entirely. So that's where the story lands. A 3-minute conversation that ended a decades-long waiting period, a king who chose the moment of departure rather than letting circumstance choose it for him, a son who accepted the wait without pretending it felt easy, and a family trying to navigate the space between duty and grief. The timeline still doesn't fully add up in places, and the secrecy around the decision clearly hurt people who deserved more warning. But the core of it, the idea that real leadership sometimes means knowing when to let go, that part feels true. And honestly, the fact that Charles apparently made the call himself, without pressure from William or anyone else, makes the whole thing harder to criticize. It wasn't about ambition or defeat. It was about recognizing that the crown had already started moving, and pretending otherwise would have been the real failure.